on behalf of the Sunshine Education and Research Center, I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar titled Psychological and Emotional Wellness in Uncertain Times, a virtual experience for teachers and families. You may be wondering, is this webinar for me? We've purposefully framed this webinar as for anyone who's dealing with new or different teaching-related duties due to COVID-19, and that covers a lot of us. Maybe you're a teacher or a college instructor dealing with new stresses in in-person education or adjusting to remote learning. Or you might be a parent who's struggling to add remote learning into your already demanding work life or home life. No matter what your role, we're seeing that these are challenging times for teachers, instructors, and families, and we want to provide tools that can help you support your wellness. We believe that these tools can not only support your psychological and emotional health, but can help you better serve the important learners in your life. Next slide, please. Before we get started, I wanted to introduce the sponsor of today's webinar, the Sunshine Education and Research Center, or SERC for short. The SERC is a center funded by the National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health. They promote the safety and health of workers by training the next generation of occupational safety and health professionals, by performing research on occupational safety and health, and by performing outreach services to businesses and communities like this webinar. If you'd like to learn more about the activities of the SERC, I encourage you to check out their website, which can be found at health.usf.edu/publichealth/ERC. I'd like to thank the SERC for their support in the planning of this workshop, particularly Kathy Silva, the director of the SERC's Continuing Education Program. She's been working really hard on the behind the scenes of this webinar, and we definitely couldn't have done it without you. Next slide, please. So why did we choose to offer this webinar? First of all, a large body of research shows that teaching is a stressful profession under the best of circumstances. Teachers may find themselves dealing with time pressure from demanding work and home schedules, student behavioral issues, a lack of resources, and other stressors. And all of this existed before a global pandemic. Teachers now find themselves adding in the stresses of new work procedures, new technologies, health and safety concerns, and student anxieties to an already stressful job. Similarly, many parents now find themselves in new teaching roles, adding these teaching-associated stressors to their existing work and home demands. It's no wonder that teachers and families are reporting anxiety and exhaustion related to COVID-19. However, there is good news. Tools that promote psychological and emotional wellness can be easily added to the toolkits of our educators. And that's what today's webinar is all about. We will hear from 3 speakers who will give you strategies to help promote your wellness during these difficult times. Next slide, please. First, we will hear from Dr. Thomas Cunningham, who is a behavioral scientist for the chief of the Social Science and Translation Research Branch in the Division of Science Integration of the National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health, or NIOSH for short. He also coordinates the NIOSH Services Sector Program and Translation Research Program. His research addresses intervention development and research translation for safety and health applications in construction, healthcare, and several small business sectors. He received his master's and PhD degrees in clinical psychology from Virginia Tech. Dr. Cunningham will be presenting on supporting teacher and staff mental health and well-being during the COVID-19 pandemic. Next, I'll be presenting on using mindfulness to participate in behaviors that matter to you. This presentation is framed in terms of using mindfulness practically in your everyday life to enable you to work safely, but you can really apply these tools more broadly to any behavior that matters to you, whether it's safe behavior or healthy behavior or positive performance during these difficult times. My name is Kristen Horan, and I'm an assistant professor in the Industrial Organizational Psychology program at the University of Central Florida. I earned my PhD from Bowling Green State University in 2018. My research focuses on improving the health, safety, and well-being of the workforce. I perform research on how to improve safety and health programming in the workplace, the unique health and safety needs of high-risk occupations, and the relationship between work and health. Rounding out our speaker presentations will be Dr. Kelsey Merlot. Kelsey Merlot is an assistant professor in the Industrial Organizational Psychology program at the University of South Florida. Her research captures the day-to-day psychological experience of working as it unfolds in the moment and across time. In particular, she explores the influence of emotions on worker functioning in the moment, the accumulation of emotional experiences to the end of the workday, and the reflection over emotional events in the form of self-defining memories. Her research has been published in peer-reviewed outlets, such as the Journal of Business and Psychology, European Journal of Work and Organizational Psychology, and featured in popular press like Psychology Today. Dr. Merlot will give a presentation on navigating the emotional demands of work. Next, we will put it all together and help you apply these strategies to a day in the life of a teacher dealing with COVID-19 related stress. Finally, we will close out with a question and answer session where you will be able to ask any of the speakers your questions. We've had some questions sent in ahead of time, but you'll also be able to type in any new questions into the chat function. I would like to point out that this chat function is visible to the entire audience, so definitely keep that in mind when you're typing in your questions. We know that you're very eager to get started, so without any further ado, I'm very pleased to introduce Dr. Thomas Cunningham.
Thanks, Kristen, and good evening, everybody. It's nice to join you. So as Kristen mentioned, I work at the National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health, and just to note, we are part of the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. And I'll be talking today about supporting teacher and staff mental health and well-being during the COVID-19 pandemic. Next slide, please. So just a quick overview of my presentation. I'm really here to try to set the stage and kick things off to the real experts who will teach you some really good strategies. First, I'll cover some of the very basic information about COVID-19, some of the symptoms and complications, how it spreads, and then talk a bit more about supporting teacher and staff mental health and well-being during the pandemic. Next slide. Just a quick disclaimer that the information that is being covered by me in this webinar is not exhaustive, and it's meant to convey critical information school administrators should use when developing plans for supporting teacher and staff mental health and well-being. If you'd like to see the full guidance and information where much of the content of my presentation is pulled from, you can reference this document, Strategies for Protecting K-12 School Staff from COVID-19. Next slide, please. So first, some information about coronavirus disease 2019 or COVID-19. Next slide. First off, how it spreads. This virus is spread mainly from person to person, from between people who are in close contact with one another, so within less than 6 feet for 15 minutes or longer. It's primarily spread through respiratory droplets produced when an infected person coughs, sneezes, or talks. These droplets can land in the mouths or noses of people who are nearby or possibly be inhaled into the lungs. COVID-19 may be spread by people who are not showing symptoms. Next slide, please. The virus that causes COVID-19 is spreading very easily and sustainably between people. Information from the ongoing pandemic suggests that the virus is spreading more efficiently than influenza or the flu, but not as efficiently as measles, which is highly contagious. The virus may be spread in other ways, and the science continues to evolve in this area. It may be possible that a person can get COVID-19 by touching a surface or object that has the virus on it and then touching their mouth or nose or possibly their eyes. This is not thought to be the main way the virus spreads, but we're still learning more about how the virus spreads. Next slide, please. Some of the symptoms of COVID-19 may include fever or chills, cough, shortness of breath or difficulty breathing, fatigue, muscle or body aches, headache, new loss of taste or smell, sore throat, congestion or runny nose, nausea or vomiting, or diarrhea. And symptoms typically appear anywhere from 2 to 14 days after exposure to the virus. Next slide, please. If you are concerned that you may have some of the symptoms that are indicative of needing emergency medical attention, things to look for would be trouble breathing, persistent pain or pressure in the chest, new confusion, inability to wake or stay awake, or bluish lips or face. And of course, this is not all of the possible symptoms, so please call your medical provider if you have any other symptoms that are severe or concerning to you. And if you call 911 or call ahead to your local emergency facility, be sure to notify the operator that you're seeking care for someone who has or may have COVID-19. Next slide, please. Some of the complications associated with the virus include a wide range of illnesses and a wide range of severity. It could be mild to severe cases, and it can result in death. Some of the most common complications of severe COVID-19 include pneumonia, respiratory failure, sepsis and septic shock, cardiomyopathy, acute kidney injury, and other illness associated with prolonged hospital stays. Next slide, please. So some of the ways to prevent exposure to COVID-19, and I'm sure these are familiar to many people at this point, obviously avoid touching your eyes, nose, and mouth, and the mask you should be wearing with unwashed hands. Avoid close contact with others, including people who are sick or those who don't live in your household. Stay home as much as possible, especially when you are sick. And when in public, wear a mask that covers your mouth and nose. When you're wearing a mask in public settings, be sure to do so, especially when other social distancing measures are difficult to maintain. Next slide, please. You should also cover your cough or sneeze with a tissue and then throw it away and wash your hands. Clean and disinfect frequently touched objects and surfaces. Wash your hands often with soap and water for at least 20 seconds. And if soap and water aren't readily available, alcohol-based hand sanitizer. If you'd like to look for more information, you can follow this link on types of disinfectants that are known to be effective against the virus that causes COVID-19. Next slide, please. So now to the topic that we all tuned in to hear about today, COVID-19 and mental health. Next slide, please. So we know, because we've been collecting data on it at CDC, that the COVID-19 pandemic has been associated with mental health challenges, both related to the, as well as related to efforts to prevent infections. So people are experiencing increased mental health challenges, not only because of fear of catching the disease or someone in their family catching the disease, but also the things that we've done to change our lives to avoid being exposed. In particular, social distancing and stay-at-home orders have had some effects on mental health. Symptoms of anxiety and depressive disorders increased considerably in the U.S. during April to June of 2020, if we compared to just that same period a year ago. Next slide, please. So some of the most recent data that was reported in the month of August indicated that during late June, roughly 40% of U.S. adults who responded to a survey reported struggling with mental health or substance use. So this was a survey of roughly 5,000 Americans, and adults that is, and you can see several different mental health issues. We saw increased levels, including not only anxiety and depression, but also increasing substance use, trauma and stressor-related disorder symptoms, and considering suicide. Next slide, please. So as Kristen mentioned in her introduction, we know that teachers and school staff are certainly having their mental health and well-being challenged by the COVID-19 pandemic. And in order to respond to the needs of this group of workers, to teachers and school staff, CDC has produced a number of guidance documents. Next slide, please. So if you peruse our CDC web pages for coronavirus, there's a number of different, my view just changed on me there. There's a number of different resources listed there, thanks. And one of those most recent additions to our toolkits came out just a week or so ago. Many of you may have seen the headlines about it. If you go to the next slide, please. And so this is the document where we actually have a specific section on mental health and well-being for teachers and staff. And so this is a document really that's for school administrators, but I'm going to walk you through some of the content in that document as it's helpful for teachers to know and offers some tools that folks can apply themselves right away. Next slide, please. So first and foremost, to protect and support the mental health of K-12 teachers and staff during the pandemic, administrators should consider providing mental health benefits, sharing information about the district's employee assistance plan, if there is one, and mental health and counseling services that are available, and being sure to remind staff what mental health benefits are included in their insurance plans. Next slide, please. Where possible, administrators should implement flexible sick leave policies and practices. We know every staff member's life outside of work is different, and many have caregiving responsibilities that they may need to take care of a sick loved one or oversee virtual learning for their own children. It's important to be understanding and flexible with leave policies and work schedules as circumstances change and needs arise. If staff are under care for mental health issues, they should follow up with their physician or mental health professionals. And schools should consider hiring and training additional substitute staff to be able to cover any shortages. Next slide, please. It's also important to evaluate changes to work design. Where possible, administrators should eliminate non-essential tasks so staff can focus on the critical ones. Trying to reduce ambiguity by providing necessary resources is important. And being sure that staff are able to take more control over how they carry out their work tasks. We know that as control over the job increases, work stress tends to decrease. Next slide, please. It's also important for administrators to support coping and resilience. Teachers and school staff should be encouraged to take breaks from watching, reading, or listening to news stories about COVID-19, including taking breaks from social media if they're feeling overwhelmed or distressed. Thanks. It's also important to encourage employees to talk with people that they trust about their concerns and how they're feeling, and to encourage employees to perform self-assessments. There's a really great tool at this website, howrightnow.org, where you can click on sort of how you're feeling from a list of different sorts of emotions, and it will walk you through some potentially useful resources. Next slide, please. It's also important to foster wellness. If administrators are educating staff about mental health, they should be encouraging open conversation about the challenges people are experiencing. If you have access to a wellness provider, consider hosting virtual mindfulness or discussion sessions. It's also important to educate staff on the importance of healthy sleep, and NIOSH has a number of useful resources on promoting healthy sleep on our website. It's also important to try to eat a healthy, well-balanced meals and drink enough water, get enough exercise, all those things that are always important to do, but easy to lose sight of as stress increases. And also just letting folks know that they can be valuable resources to one another by sharing their coping strategies. Next slide. Additionally, if folks are working remotely, it's important to remember that being physically distant doesn't have to mean being socially distant. As we're using virtual platforms, we can use them to continue team building and staff meetings that can be good for morale and helping to foster a sense of community and togetherness. When doing so, be sure to be inclusive, provide opportunities for staff at all levels in all departments to participate in these sorts of interactions. Next slide. And thinking about this increasing shift to a digital or virtual learning environment, It's important that people are provided and take advantage of training, as staff members may have different levels of ability with using virtual platforms and new learning technologies. Having to learn new technology very rapidly can be extremely stressful and place a lot of new job demands on folks. So being able to take advantage of training that's offered can help a lot with reducing those demands and reducing stress. And finally, it's important for folks at all levels within the school system to model healthy behavior. So school leaders and teachers should be taking care of their own physical, social, and psychological needs. And by doing so, they serve as a role model and set the tone that it's acceptable and important to take care of yourself. Next slide. So now I'll just briefly point you to a few CDC resources that are available. These slides will be available to all the attendees to reference later, so you can check out all of these great resources. Next slide. So for COVID-19 basics, there's tons of information on the CDC website, and you can get to all of the resources that are mentioned here from that first link of cdc.gov/coronavirus listed here. Next slide. On some of the subpages, there's more basic information about how to slow the spread and CDC communication resources. Next slide, please. And finally, there's several new resources on our website for K-12 school administrators that you see here. Next slide. As well as resources for parents, guardians, and caregivers. Next slide. And that concludes my presentation. I'm happy to turn it back over to Kristen. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Cunningham, for that very informative presentation. Next, I'll be talking on how to use mindfulness to improve workplace safety or any behavior that matters to you. Next slide, please. As human beings, we have a habit of getting into our own heads, and our thoughts often take us out of the present moment. Just think for a moment about how much of our day we spend reliving moments that occurred in the past, worrying over the future, or thinking about something other than the present moment, like our to-do list or what we have at home waiting for us when we get home from school. So when we might encounter this in multiple moments in our daily life. So when we're with our family, we might be thinking about work. When we're at work, we might be thinking about our home life. And then when we're sleeping, we're thinking about everything, or at least when we're trying to sleep. So on top of this, we also have a habit about judging those thoughts when we get into our own heads. So let's say a student or a learner is really stressing us out. They have a few challenging behavioral tendencies. We might label this sense of dread at interacting with them the next day as bad or wrong and tell ourselves that we shouldn't be feeling that way. Or if we think to ourselves something like, I can't handle my day tomorrow, we might label this thought as right or the truth. And suddenly these thoughts become very powerful, and they can kind of make the present moment a little bit more miserable. So mindfulness is a practice that challenges these tendencies by encouraging more intentional awareness, a focus on the present moment, and non-judgment. This means that we pay attention on purpose to our thoughts, feelings, and sensations in the present moment, and we don't label them as good or bad or right or wrong. Next slide, please. Mindfulness can be a very powerful tool for your health and your performance or any behavior at work. Research consistently supports that mindfulness is positively associated with better physical and mental health, more positive performance at work, and safe behaviors at work. Next slide, please. So how exactly does mindfulness support effective work behaviors, such as safe work behaviors? There are two pathways that I like to think about. First, when you are paying attention in the present moment, it allows you to more effectively scan your environment for any potential threats to your safety. If we are mentally somewhere else in our thoughts, it's easier to just let things wash over us. And if we don't notice something, we can't address it. Second, the non-judgment piece of mindfulness allows you to establish a healthy distance from stressful thoughts, and it allows you to behave in a way that supports your goal, even if it's not what that thought is encouraging you to do. So let's go with the previous example of, I can't handle my day tomorrow. If we deem this thought to be truthful, then it's likely to influence our behavior in a negative way. We might participate in behaviors to push away that negative thought. So maybe we drink a little bit too much of our favorite adult beverage in order to make ourselves temporarily feel better. But when we wake up the next morning, ultimately we might not be feeling up to our tasks or to our new safe work procedures. Or we might decide to not even try based on our assessment of the situation and ultimately end up with more tasks building up and more stress. A non-judgmental appraisal from mindfulness would help us treat this thought, I can't handle my day tomorrow, as just that, a thought. It's not necessarily right or wrong, and it doesn't control our actions. Even with that thought in our head, we can still participate in behaviors that match our goals. Next slide, please. Even though many people have heard of the benefits of mindfulness, there are still a number of obstacles standing in our way of being more mindful. So some people might think that these concepts are all hype and no substance. They might feel that formal meditation programs aren't for them or are too intimidating. And especially relevant to this group are time-related obstacles. Sometimes people are just too busy to do long formal meditations. And finally, sometimes we just go through the motions of a mindfulness meditation. It's almost like we do it to check a box on our daily to-do list, but then we forget to bring those lessons learned with us into our daily life. Next slide, please. As an alternative or complement to formal mindfulness meditation, I'll be offering strategies for practical mindfulness, which is a term that I use to refer to mindfulness that fits seemingly into our everyday life. We will be talking about 4 strategies today. Next slide, please. The first strategy is called informal mindfulness practice. This refers to weaving mindfulness into day-to-day tasks that you are already performing. Instead of just going through the motions of these tasks, you savor every single aspect of seemingly mundane experiences. So think of the last time that you did something as simple as fold the laundry. It was probably a pretty mindless task. But now imagine that during that task, you savored all of the little things about that experience. How pleasant the towels smell, the feeling of the soft fabric on your fingertips, or the sound of the gentle hum of the next load of laundry in the dryer. Suddenly, a dull task on our to-do list becomes almost meditative, and it becomes a lot easier to focus on the present moment. It's almost like there's no room left in our head for the worry thoughts over your next class. I've listed a few examples of everyday experiences that are great opportunities for informal practice, meaning that we have a tendency to slip out of the present moment during these daily activities. But remember, these are just ideas. You know your day best and how informal practice will fit into your seemingly mundane activities. Next slide, please. The next strategy is to use helpful metaphors to help you relate to stressful appraisals in a mindful way. This may sound kind of silly, but words and concepts play a really powerful role in how we respond to our internal experiences. They can help remind us of important yet abstract concepts in difficult moments. The overall goal of these metaphors is the same: to help you remember that your thoughts, feelings, and experiences do not control you, and you are free to choose whatever behavior is most effective for your goals, even in the presence of that stress. One of the most common metaphors is called clouds in the sky. This is where you picture any stress that you have as written on a cloud that's very far away from you. You notice that the clouds in the sky are not constant. There may be days with very few clouds and some days with a lot of clouds. Some clouds may float away quickly, whereas some may linger for a little while longer. But the important thing is to recognize is that the clouds are not constant and they don't control you. Another similar metaphor is passengers on a bus. In this metaphor, unpleasant thoughts, feelings, and sensations are kind of like noisy passengers on a bus, but you are the driver. The passengers may chatter all they want to, but ultimately you decide where the bus goes and when it stops. In very stressful situations, it can feel like worry, sadness, anger, or other unpleasant feelings are driving the bus. This metaphor can help you remind yourself that you are in control. The final helpful metaphor that I'll discuss is one of my favorites. It's visitors in your house. In this metaphor, you can imagine unpleasant thoughts, feelings, and sensations, kind of like visitors in your house. Maybe visitors that you have a hard time welcoming. So some people like to imagine a nosy in-law. And although it can be hard to have them in your house, it ultimately might do more harm than good to try to kick them out of your house. So if there are any visitors that are hard to welcome into your emotional house, just give yourself a reminder that these visitors do come and go, but ultimately you are in charge of the rules of your house. Next slide, please. The next strategy, called threshold meditation, involves using your physical space as a prompt to be mindful. It's a chance to put down your excess stress baggage when you enter a new place. A threshold refers to an entryway into a space, kind of like a doorway. And this threshold meditation involves reminding yourself to be physically and mentally present when you enter that space. So too often we can be physically somewhere, but mentally in another place. And this is a way to challenge that tendency. So a way that I've used threshold meditation in the past is when I entered the doorway to my gym, I would take a moment to leave my work baggage at the door and remind myself to be 100% present with my workout. There are many opportunities that you could use for threshold meditation. So maybe when you enter your classroom, you take a pledge to leave your worry about your home to-do list at the door. Or maybe when you enter your door to your house, you leave your work baggage at the door, at least temporarily, so that you can enjoy time with your partner, your kids, your pet, or even just a little time for yourself. Next slide, please. The final strategy that we'll talk about today is called finding an anchor in the present moment. There are things that can tether you to the present moment, even in a turbulent sea of stress. By finding something that is always in the present moment, an anchor, you will be able to bring yourself back into the present moment if you find your mind slipping somewhere else. Most people like to focus on their current breath because that's always in the present moment. So whenever you find yourself ruminating over the past or worrying over the future, just take a moment to notice how it feels to have your breath go in and out. A really important component, however, is gentle acknowledgement. Try to avoid beating yourself up if you catch yourself out of the present moment. You can even thank your mindfulness skills for helping you notice when you were out of that present moment. Next slide, please. So now that you have strategies to help you insert mindfulness into your daily life, I'd like to end by talking about two complementary approaches that work very well with mindfulness. The first is self-compassion, which refers to treating yourself with kindness in difficult moments. The second is values-based action, which refers to behaving in ways that match your values. Next slide, please. Let's talk a little bit more about self-compassion. This involves treating yourself with kindness as opposed to criticizing yourself. It also involves recognizing that it's part of the human condition to struggle and that you are not alone in your struggle. So too often when we're struggling with stress, we talk to ourselves in a very critical way. And I'd like to encourage you to instead try to talk to yourself like you would somebody that you care about, maybe a student that you really care for or your child, and kind of give yourself the pep talk that you would give them if they were struggling with new stress related to COVID-19. Next slide, please. Let's wrap up this presentation with a discussion about the bigger picture, and this is referred to as values-based action. We've talked about using mindfulness as a tool to participate in effective behavior, whether it's following a safety protocol at work or another behavior that's important to you. But how do you know what an effective behavior is? One metric of effective behavior is whether or not it's in line with your values. Next slide, please. Values refer to core beliefs that guide us. And although this sounds simple, too often it's difficult to know what our values are. One simple way is to imagine that you were organizing a race. You would put a cause on your shirt for the world to see. If you were to think of your life as that race that you're organizing, what would you want your shirt to say? Some people might have family, honesty, compassion, or bravery listed on their shirt. There's no right or wrong answer. This is a very personal thought exercise. I encourage you to regularly spend time thinking about what you would want to be on your shirt. Next slide, please. However, sometimes what you want your shirt to say and what it actually says based on your behaviors can be a different message. Especially if you're trying to push stress away, you might not be behaving consistently with your values. I'll share an example from my personal life. If I want my shirt to say compassion, yet due to COVID-19, my workload is insane, I might try to push that stress away by minimizing non-essential interactions with students, things like cutting my office hours so that I have extra time to work on my to-do list. But based on my behaviors, no one would know that I want my shirt to say compassion. Next slide, please. So that's the goal of this session, to give you tools that can help you maintain a healthy level of distance from your COVID-related stress. You can recognize that these appraisals are not necessarily truth, and they don't control you. Even though certain aspects of the world may feel out of control, recognize that you are in control of your behaviors and your work life, and it can reflect what is important to you, even during these difficult times. Next slide, please. So I wanted to thank you for your attention during that presentation. And with that, I will turn it over to Dr. Merlot.
Thank you, Kristen. Hello, everybody. My name is Kelsey Merlot. I'm an assistant professor at the University of South Florida. And today I'm really excited to be talking with everybody about some of my expertise around emotional experiences and regulatory resources at work. Specifically, today I'm going to be talking about how we can manage our emotional experiences in the moment, how we can detach from our work when we go home to our families, and then finally, how we can work to mitigate professional burnouts due to COVID-19 and all these stressors that we're dealing with. After discussing each of these pieces, managing our emotions in the moment, detaching from work when we get home, and minimizing the risk of burnout, we'll have a brief integration and then we'll come back together for a role-playing exercise with Kristen to practice applying some of the techniques we discussed today into our actual lives. So to kick us off, we're going to address how we can effectively manage our emotions during our workday. So there are things that happen over the course of a workday that can lead to emotions, such as a parent being rude or a child finally figuring out a lesson. Evolutionarily, our emotions are really important. They help direct our behavior so we can flee from a lion or fight someone stealing our food. Because of this evolutionary basis, our emotions can be very strong and very automatic. Of course, this automatic response can sometimes now get us into trouble. What was once an evolutionary advantage can be dysfunctional. For example, has anyone had someone steal their lunch out of a communal fridge? I have. The irrational anger we feel when someone steals our food, evolutionarily, that makes a lot of sense. That might have been the difference between life or death. Now, it just might mean an additional trip to the grocery store. So we have these strong emotional reactions, these evolutionary grounded emotional reactions, but they may not always be appropriate, particularly for teachers in a classroom environment. For example, as much as you might want to shake an administrator for giving you even more work, it's probably not the best idea. So instead, we do things to regulate our emotions. Emotional labor is the process of changing our felt or expressed emotions to better match the demands of our environment. As teachers or parents, you're likely expected to be positive and engaging and cheerful while interacting with the learners in your environment, no matter how you might actually be feeling that day. To modify our emotions, there are two broad strategies we can use. The first is called surface acting, where we change the expression of emotion to meet the demands of our work environment. This is the grin and bear it approach. Instead of yelling at a frustrating student, we paste on a happy face and we mask how we're actually feeling. The second strategy is called deep acting. We actually change our emotions to match what we must feel. So despite potentially interacting with a frustrating student, we pump ourselves up so we can actually feel positively as we continue to teach. We actually change how we feel to match what we must show. Interestingly, deep acting is related to much better outcomes. A meta-analysis of 95 studies, so there's a lot of really good research around this, suggests that deep acting, this light gold color on the slides you're seeing, is related to lower psychosomatic complaints like sleep disturbances, aches and pains, lower levels of job burnout, which we'll cover in greater detail later in this presentation, and higher levels of job satisfaction compared to surface acting. So while just pasting on a happy face, this grin bear it approach might feel easier in the moment, actually changing how we feel to match what we must show is a healthier response in the short and long term. So deep acting is better strategies for ourselves and for our work performance. How might we go around actually engaging in this strategy? So I wanted to use an example of an emotional listening event that would be relevant to teachers. So I texted my sister, who teaches middle school science in South Carolina, and asked her what drives her absolutely nuts at school. And I just have to say, you teachers have a lot to deal with. So in this abbreviated list of what she sent me, she does really love her job, I promise. She listed a lack of communication, dealing with student discipline, students not having pencils, students leaving crucial class materials in their locker, students forgetting they had a test despite continual reminders, and then, of course, staff meetings that could have been an email. I think anyone can relate to that one. So needless to say, teachers have a lot of opportunities to regulate their emotions. For today, I'm going to focus on something I think a lot of us are dealing with right now, particularly with the COVID-19 pandemic. So when the technology does not work. Okay, so you are teaching online, hybrid, some kind of technology-mediated communication. You log on to teach your class. You are prepped. You are ready to go. And then your computer decides this is the perfect time to update and restart itself. Perfect. So how do we go about regulating our emotions? First, we want to identify how we're feeling. This is called emotion granularity, specifically identifying what emotion you are feeling. If the technology stops working, how do you feel? Are you angry that you're being asked to teach online? Are you frustrated that you can't teach online because of something as silly as an update? Concerned that your students aren't going to be online by the time you log back on? Identifying precisely how you are feeling is an important first step in emotion regulation. For example, are you angry that you're being asked to teach online? Anger is usually a response to some kind of threat, like someone stealing your food. So are you feeling threatened by the demands to teach online? Is your professional efficacy feeling threatened? Are you frustrated, on the other hand? Frustration is usually about some kind of obstacle that you can't overcome. So is it just the technology being problematic that is an obstacle to you being the amazing teacher you have been in the past? Identifying precisely how we're feeling, this distinction between anger and frustration, can allow us to more effectively regulate that emotion. For me personally, with my fun times teaching online, frustration is usually what comes to mind first when the technology starts acting up. So we're feeling frustrated because our computer has decided to restart in the middle of class. Now we need to regulate that emotion. We've already discussed how deep acting is the more effective emotion regulation strategy. So within that, there are two approaches we can use to engage in deep acting. First is attention deployment. Change what you're paying attention to. Instead of staring at the progress bar on your computer very slowly updating, take a moment to distract yourself. You can't do anything about the loading time anyways, so you might as well pay attention to something that'll make you feel less frustrated. For me, I browse cute dogs on Instagram. Any of the mindfulness techniques that Kristen just talked about would also be a perfect instance of attentional deployment to regulate a negative emotion. Second, is cognitive change, which is actively changing how we feel about the instigating event. Yes, the computer restarting is frustrating. However, can it also be kind of funny? An amusing story that we can tell our friends and family later? At this point, I think everyone knows teaching online is going to be full of hiccups. Perhaps this can be just a funny anecdote that we can laugh about a year from now. Relatedly, I am a university professor. I'm also teaching online now. And my first day teaching online this semester, within 10 minutes to my first class, I very enthusiastically backhanded a full cup of coffee all across my desk. This is a 100% true story. I'm not making it up for this webinar. And at the time, I was so embarrassed. Like, how unprofessional. I had to pause my video, take apart my nice workstation I had set up because I completely ruined my keyboard. It was a complete mess. But then I decided to change how I was thinking about the event. Sure, it's embarrassing. I backhanded a cup of coffee in front of an entire class of university students. But also, it's hopefully kind of humanizing, right? I'm no longer just a professor behind a screen, but a real person struggling through teaching online, just like my students are struggling to learn online. By changing how I thought about this event, I was able to change my emotions around it as well. So we've managed our emotions. The next thing we need to do is manage the rumination around this. Rumination are these reoccurring, repetitive thoughts around some kind of thing. In other words, you just keep thinking about the emotional event. For example, I can't believe my computer restarted in the middle of class. I can't believe I backhanded my coffee all across my desk. My students must think I'm so unprepared. How are they going to think about me from now on? I'm so embarrassed, and on and on and on. These repetitive thoughts are not good. They don't solve any problems, and they can actually prolong the duration and the intensity of your negative emotions. They make you feel worse for longer. So problem solving is great, right? How am I going to fix this specific problem? How am I going to make sure my computer doesn't restart in the middle of class again? But once a solution is found, move on. Once again, Kristen has some just really fantastic mindfulness techniques that she covered in case you find yourself really ruminating on some emotional event that happened during your day. Another good technique that I like to use is to really make sure I strongly detach from my work when I stop working, which conveniently is our second topic for my presentation today, how we can detach from our work when we stop working. Even though we may be working from home due to COVID-19 and not transitioning physical spaces from work to home, we can still make sure we take the time to detach from our work at the end of the workday to really rest and recover. So when we go home, or we at least stop working, we want to make sure we take time to recover from the demands of the workday. Psychological recovery is the process of replenishing energetic resources that are lost. For example, some days are just exhausting. We get home, we don't even want to bother cooking dinner, let alone answering emails. Recovery is an important part of replenishing these lost resources. So when we return to work, we have more energy and engagement, and we can serve our learners better. For recovery, it's not so much the activity that matters as its attributes. Recovery experiences are characterized by 4 attributions: psychological detachment, or not thinking about work during non-work times; relaxation, or engaging in activities with a low activation level; mastery, such as facing a positive challenge or learning something new; and then finally control, or feeling like you have some degree of control or agency over your non-work time. Far and away, psychological detachment is one of the strongest predictors for recovery. And I know that detachment can have some negative connotations around it, particularly around teaching and learning and these passion careers that we have. So I want to be really clear. Detaching from your work does not mean that you don't care about your students and your learners. It means you are taking the time to protect yourself and your health, emotional and physical. Psychological detachment has become increasingly difficult since we're all connected with cell phones, and I expect it's only gotten worse for teachers who are now teaching online. There's a constant barrage of emails, texts, phone calls, and it can make it very difficult to step away from your work and to detach. However, setting these healthy boundaries is critical for your own well-being. Detaching from your work may not be possible every night, but making it a priority will allow you to be a better and healthier teacher long-term. So, what counts as a recovery experience? It can differ from person to person. My sister, for example, loves puzzles. For her, puzzles allow her to detach, relax, and have feelings of mastery and control over her environment. Me, on the other hand, I hate puzzles. They may allow me to detach from my work a little bit, but only because I'm so frustrated trying to do a puzzle. They're not relaxing, they don't make me feel masterful, and I don't feel like I have control over my activity. For me, it's just not replenishing. The point is to find an activity that is replenishing for you. I've listed out a few common recovery activities on the slide here. It can be exercising or going for a walk, cooking, crafting or woodworking, calling loved ones, playing in the garden. All of these can help with recovery to some degree. One of the biggest things, though, is to make sure you're actually able to psychologically detach. Turn off your cell phone, disconnect your email. Take some time to step back from your work and be confident that if there is a true emergency, somebody will call. For me, the best recovery experience is to go and play in my garden. I leave my phone in the house, I put my foster dog on a leash, and I go walk around and look at all the plants I'm trying very hard to keep alive. It allows me to detach from my work and think about something that is positive, relaxing, and growing. So, okay, we've discussed how to manage our emotions, regulate our emotions throughout the day, and how to more effectively recover from workday stressors when they go home. Now we're going to take a more long-term perspective and discuss burnout. So burnout is a psychological syndrome characterized by a chronic depletion of resources. It has 3 underlying facets. The first is emotional exhaustion, or just feeling physically and emotionally depleted, similar to compassion fatigue, when you just don't have the energy to care anymore. It's also characterized by cynicism, or a negative and callous response to aspects of the job. For example, a cynical response could be, "Nothing I do will help my learners." And the final aspect is a decreased personal efficacy or feelings of incompetence. I'm not a good teacher and I will never be a good teacher. It's not true. All of this can result from a chronic depletion of resources, which means 1, burnout is unlikely to develop overnight, but 2, it's also unlikely to be fixed overnight. Burnout is a huge problem for teachers. Even before the pandemic, burnout rates in teachers were absurdly high. With the extra demands on teachers during COVID, I expect it's only going to get worse. For those of you who did fill out our pre-event survey, first of all, thank you. Second of all, one of the measures was a burnout measure. And you guys, we have some really burned out people in our webinar. We have some people who derive a great deal of personal meaning and pride from their work, but who also are just exhausted. So I really want to make sure that we address the burnout today and the steps we can do to try and address it. So, okay, how can we prevent or at least minimize the effects of burnout? So burnout is generally influenced by two things: our job demands and our job resources. Job demands are things that tend to drain us of our energetic resources, while job resources tend to energize us. Job demands are typically things related to our work role overload, role conflict, or role ambiguity. For example, having too much work to do, being asked to do multiple work activities that are in conflict with each other, or having unclear expectations for your work role can all lead to higher levels of burnout. And I'm not going to sugarcoat this. The pandemic has likely only made all of this harder. Having to teach hybrid or online classes, or at least be prepared to transition rapidly to online, has likely increased your workload. Being asked to serve on the front lines of a pandemic and police students' public health behaviors may be in conflict to your primary goal of teaching. And with the transition online, your exact role may be more ambiguous. How available are you expected to be while teaching online? Where is the line for managing students' behaviors if they're tuning in from their own homes? All of this is really not great for your risk of burnout. And as much as I wish I did, I don't have all of the answers for reducing your job demands. What we can do today is at least start a discussion around how we can minimize and be strategic about some of these demands. So, first one is role overload. There are not enough hours in the day and you have too much work to do. Think strategically. What can you reasonably drop from your workload that will have a minimal impact on students' learning? What activities can you say no to avoid taking on new work? Maybe this is not the semester to try a new and ambitious group project. Learn to better estimate how much time things actually take. I like to joke that if I think something will take 30 minutes, guaranteed it's going to take an hour. But that's often true. People tend to vastly underestimate how long it will take to complete certain tasks. So try to practice that skill of being realistic in how long it will take you to accomplish something. Role conflict. You're being asked to fulfill multiple roles that are in direct conflict with each other. For example, you're supposed to teach while policing mask wearing. You're supposed to provide emotional support to students while also being a strict disciplinarian. Are there ways to make these different roles be more congruent? Are there organizational supports in place that you can use to minimize this conflict? For example, if a student refuses to wear a mask, does your administration have a plan in place so you can continue to focus on teaching? Take advantage of these resources if they exist, and if they don't, please push your administration to put them in place. As many hats as teachers have to wear, and parents as they're dealing with this remote learning, try to discard the hats that are conflicting and find the ones that have synergy associated with them. Finally is role ambiguity. So you're being asked to teach in person, online, hybrid, at the same time, talk to parents, talk to students, talk to administration. It's a lot all at once, right? Your exact role may not be perfectly clear. If it's possible, get clarification from your administration about what is your responsibility and, just importantly, what is not your responsibility. In the absence of administrative guidance, set clear expectations about your role to students, parents, and colleagues. For example, clear communication that you will not respond to emails after 6 p.m. Perhaps your role as a teacher ends at that point. Reducing the amount of ambiguity in your role can help mitigate these negative effects of burnout. Of course, there are major limitations on how much we can change about our work roles. Some days there's just going to be a lot to do. Fortunately, we can also minimize the risks of burnout by paying attention to our job resources. So remember, job resources are the things that provide us with energy. They make us feel reinvigorated and re-energized. One of the most robust ways to reinvigorate ourselves and minimize the risks of burnout is to seek out social support. So Tom mentioned this as well in his presentation. Social support are the friends, families, and coworkers that provide emotional, practical, and informational support during times of stress. Emotional support is exactly what it sounds like, showing empathy and being emotionally supportive as people deal with stress. Practical support means providing practical help or services, helping prepare for face-to-face teaching, or providing resources to aid in the transition to remote. Informational support is providing information that can help people make informed decisions. For example, providing clear information about expectations for teachers doing hybrid classes and accessible resources, not hour-long modules, on how to teach effectively online. Some of these support structures are hopefully being provided to you by your administrators. If there are any administrators tuning in, please make sure you're making a concerted and clear effort to support your teachers. Provide clear information and practical resources when possible. I understand that resources are limited. At the very least, please try to be upfront and honest to your teachers. Clear communication channels can be its own form of support. For teachers, hopefully these networks of caring relationships are already developed. However, it's also likely that these networks may be under additional strain. Because of COVID and social distancing, we may have lost many of our normal ways of connecting with others and strengthen these social support networks. We're not seeing coworkers in the hallway, large gatherings are discouraged, and we're not going to dinner or coffee with friends and family as often. What this means is we may need to be intentional about how we maintain these social support networks. We may not be able to have a start of semester party, but maybe we can have a Zoom happy hour or go for a socially distant walk in the park. Finding creative ways to continue to connect with those around us is incredibly important. It's not only related to decreased burnout, but to decreased loneliness, higher well-being, and decreased physical strain. So I do want to take a moment just to say, I know social support can be a kind of tricky topic, especially for people who are already stressed, anxious, and burned out. Hopefully, it's very few of you, but for now, I'm going to assume it's kind of a lot of you. One of the trickiest things about stress and anxiety is that it makes us not want to reach out to others. And reaching out to others is one of the best things we can do to minimize the effects of burnout. I'm not a K through 12 teacher, but I have never once in my life been upset when a friend or colleague reaches out to me for support. And I imagine this extends to most people. So don't let your stress or anxiety get in the way. Make sure you are intentionally reaching out to people in your network and getting the social support you need. So, as a recap for today, we've discussed how we can manage our emotions in the moment by identifying, regulating, and then disengaging with our negative emotions over the course of the workday. We've discussed how we can psychologically detach from our work when we get home by engaging in activities that allow us to rest and recover. And we've discussed how to mitigate the negative effects of job burnout by trying to minimize our job demands and engaging our social support networks. I do want to take a quick moment to say, I sincerely hope these resources are helpful to teachers, administrators, and parents that are watching and tuning in today. These recommendations are backed by good scientific research. However, they are not a replacement for a good clinician. If you find yourself struggling with anxiety, depression, or any kind of emotional distress, please reach out to your employee assistance program or a good clinician. There's a national suicide hotline that provides free and confidential services to anyone who may be struggling, and employee assistance programs as well should be free and confidential programs offered to employees. So after that quick aside, thank you so much for joining us here today. I hope I was able to provide some resources that are useful. If you have any questions, please feel free to type them into the chat. We will be doing a Q&A at the end of the presentations, and I'm happy to answer any questions you might have. Thank you again.
So I want to just take a quick moment to thank all of our speakers, and also recognize that sometimes when you receive information, although it's helpful, you might have trouble envisioning how it fits into your workday. You know, we're talking about these pretty abstract concepts, and when it comes down to putting it into your schedule, how can that get done? And so we wanted to take a moment to realistically preview what your day might be like amidst the new stress of COVID-19, and talk about ways to insert some of the lessons learned from today's presentations into your day. So Dr. Merlot is going to help me out with this, and she's going to kind of introduce the backstory behind our role-playing exercise as well.
Great, thank you, Kristen. So we're going to do a little role-playing exercise. Small shout out, this is my little sister. She is a middle school science teacher in South Carolina and has very graciously agreed to take a series of ridiculous photos for us so we can walk through what a day in the life and a teacher might be like. So kicking it off, good morning. It is time to start the new school year. I know teachers get up way too early, so just wanted to go ahead and acknowledge that right off the bat. Good morning. New year, new you, or at least new technology as we're attempting to transition to teaching online. I'm sure that with this new transition, there's lots of new tech you're being asked to use. I know I'm being asked to use brand new video conferencing software in my classes at the university. And it is coming with all sorts of challenges associated with it. Not least is little cats that don't want you to plug in your microphone. So that's Jinx, the cat. Finally, we can also be trying to get some work done, and things inevitably go wrong. Our non-work life interferes with our work life. And there just is, at times, just astonishing little balance between our work and our non-work lives. This, I think, is a just fantastic opportunity, Kristen, to talk about various mindfulness exercises we can use when our work and our non-work worlds collide together in the worst ways possible.
Absolutely. So when you are kind of experiencing this stress of your work and non-work colliding, I think it's important to kind of take a moment to do what we call a body scan and a little mind scan. So that can be a way to kind of check in with yourself and be mindful in that present moment. You might notice in this picture, I'm having some worry thoughts. Maybe my cats are going to screw up today's lesson plan that was sitting in an open Word document. You might also notice some physiological reactions that go along with it. So maybe you feel your heart rate increase, or you might feel a tension in your abdomen or in your shoulders. And so we talked about how when you're not being mindful and when you don't notice an issue, it's impossible to address it. So when you notice those thoughts and sensations, like maybe I'm tensing up, if you notice it, you can address it, you can release, you can establish that distance from that thought, you can take whatever precautions necessary to kind of calm that physiological reaction. And then you can decide what's your values-based action that you want to do in this situation. Do you want to show your students that you have a passion for teaching even in this environment? And how can you do that even in this difficult situation?
Awesome. One of the things I really like about your example, Kristen, as well, is our physiology and our emotions are really closely intertwined, right? And so you think like just gently smiling can have an opportunity to elevate our mood. And so when we see these negative events and we can feel ourselves tensing up and clenching our fists and furrowing our brow, just taking a moment to do that body scan you mentioned and just relax our body also has the added benefit of doing a little bit of the emotion regulation work for us. It makes our emotion regulation strategies a little bit more effective when we can change our physiology as well. So we have our work and non-work lives colliding a little bit.
I also wanted to mention, so we talked about that informal mindfulness practice, and that's savoring these seemingly mindless activities in your life. However, those mindless activities that we talked about are somewhat neutral. Even though you might not like laundry, you don't have the same anxiety reaction to a basket of unfolded laundry as you do to cats jumping all across your computer screen. So I do want to take a moment to talk about how even seemingly unwelcome interruptions can be opportunities for you to savor that moment. I'm a mom of a 3.5-year-old, so I do get a lot of seemingly unwelcome interruptions to my workday. And although the instant reaction is, oh my God, I'm never going to get any work done. I find that if I really savor that moment and, look at how his eyes look when they're looking up at me, really hear how his voice sounds when he's saying my name, suddenly it enables me to just kind of stay present in the moment and behave in a way that kind of helps me be the mom that I want to be and helps me be the worker that I want to be in that moment.
That's really beautiful. I like that savoring approach. I might have to try it with my foster dog next time he tries to knock over my desk. So finally getting some work done. We have our work and non-work spheres colliding. Then we transition to actually teaching. In this example, students are going to act like students. For those of y'all who are tuning in, yes, that student is slingshotting a mask across the classroom. So just wanted to recognize students going to be wild, y'all. After that, we can also have problems with our technology. And so this is a real example that my sister sent me, which I just stinking love. She got a dot cam and plugged it in. And when she plugged in her dot cam, it flipped her video upside down. So the technology just, of course, has all of these quirks. And I think this is another great opportunity to really kind of talk through an emotion regulation process for something like your video being flipped upside down, which can be just so frustrating in the moment, particularly for those of us who are maybe not the most technologically savvy. So remember, for our emotion regulation strategies, the first thing we want to do is really identify exactly how we're feeling. Are we frustrated? Are we disappointed? Are we just really furious right now? I'm going to go with technology, frustrated. And then I want to engage in some deep acting emotion regulation strategies. So if I'm live in a webinar, it's probably not the most appropriate thing for me to get on my phone and start looking at photos of cute dogs. But maybe I can change this into, you know what, glitches in a live webinar. Woo, it's going to be a wild ride, guys. Hopefully the people on the other end of the screen are getting some entertainment out of it. You know what, we can take this as a learning experience and just kind of quickly move on from it, which of course is the last step, is making sure we're not engaging in any kind of ruminative, repetitive, uncontrollable thoughts about some kind of negative event. Luckily, if we are able to really effectively change our emotional reaction to some kind of negative event, it should decrease our chances of ruminating on it, because it's no longer something that is a negative event that we have to deal with and is going to capture our attention. Assuming maybe we're not 100% successful with our emotion regulation strategies, this is once again just a perfect opportunity to practice some of the mindfulness techniques that Kristen mentioned, like taking a beat, taking a deep breath, doing a body scan, and then letting go of that emotion and moving on to the next thing we need to accomplish. So we've made it through our first class pseudo-successfully, had a couple of tech errors, maybe backhanded a coffee across our keyboard, but you know what? We made it through. But now we're feeling a little bit overwhelmed. Kristen, I think this one is right up your alley.
Absolutely. So this is such a relatable moment. I mean, I've had so many moments like this where I've made it through the first meeting of a day, or maybe the first class of a day, and I just feel completely spent. And I say to myself, I don't know how I'm going to get through the rest of my meetings or the rest of my classes. I've done 1/4 of my day, and I have 3/4 to go. So really, there's a lot here that's happening in her. In Lauren's cognitions, and we can just kind of see it in her body language. But there's some past moments that she's reliving, which would be her first class. So maybe she's kind of still caught up in that, the frustration of that tech glitch from the first class. And maybe she's worrying over some future events. So she's saying, like, if I couldn't even get through the first class without a tech glitch, imagine what's going to happen for the rest of the day. And so if you put together those past-oriented thoughts and those future-oriented thoughts, we can figure out that our teacher isn't really being mindful in this moment. So here would be a great opportunity to use some of those informal practices. I would recommend maybe anchor in the present moment, kind of focusing on her breath in the current moment, or one of those helpful metaphors. So if she takes the frustration of tech issues and puts it on that cloud far, far away and just watches it kind of float away and disappear before the next class, then I think she'll start her next class with a little bit more energy and a little bit more enthusiasm for that present moment.
Great, thank you so much, Kristen. So we've done our mindfulness exercise. We've watched our frustration float away. We have made it through our first day of classes. We get home and oh my gosh, we still have a million things to do. The cats need to be fed. Our lovely husband, shout out to Farrell, has not cleaned the kitchen. We have a million bags to unload. There's just so much going on, right? And this is where that psychological detachment, that rest and recovery can become important. So like I mentioned earlier, we may not be able to do this every night, but making it a priority to really carve out the time to rest and recover using an activity that is replenishing for us, that allows us to psychologically detach, to engage in relaxation, mastery, and control experiences. Lindsay, in this example here, is reading a book. Right? It allows her to detach from her workday. It's going to capture her attention so she's not continuing to ruminate on the tech glitch or whatever other mishaps may have occurred across the day. And it allows her to sit on her patio and really relax. Remember, the recovery experience that you want to use is a recovery experience that works for you. If reading is not detaching or relaxing, don't read. Go for a walk, go for a run, go play in the dirt in your garden. Do something that allows you to rest and recover, and as much as possible, make it a priority to take care of your own emotional well-being. Another thing we can do to minimize, to allow us to really recover from the day and to minimize the chances of burnout, is to really leverage these social support networks that we have. So this was Lindsay with some of her friends on, I believe, a Zoom call, some kind of video call, which has actually multiple benefits, which I'm excited to talk about for a hot second. So not only are you leveraging your social support network, right, getting that emotional support. There's another teacher on this call, so maybe even getting practical or informational support as well on how to more effectively teach in this new normal we find ourselves in. But also, you're also getting to psychologically detach, right? If you're talking about what is going on with your friend's super cute dog in the frame, you're probably not thinking about work. It's a dual benefit of engaging with people in your social support network. It's a resource that you can use to re-energize and reinvigorate yourself. And it can be a way to really psychologically detach from your work and get that space. So when you re-engage the next day, you have the energy and the engagement to be the best version of yourself as a teacher. And finally, at the end of the day, we have attempting to sleep. Kristen, I think this one is you again.
Yeah, so I want to say that this is definitely a relatable outcome of stress. It's prevalent in teachers, but it's also prevalent across the workforce as a whole. So if we experience these stressors during our workday, we have a tendency to kind of carry them with us when we try to sleep at night. We received quite a few questions about this in the pre-event survey. So we did want to make sure that we took this opportunity to address some healthy sleep habits. So one of the prevailing models of healthy sleep focuses on how our thoughts influence our sleep and our behaviors influence our sleep. So let's talk about that thought component first. So when you are having a night of rough sleep, you roll over and you see that it's 3 a.m. and you still haven't fallen asleep. What's one of the first thoughts that pops into your head? For most people, it's, oh my gosh, I have such a demanding day tomorrow. I'll never be able to make it through that day. And so suddenly we're in that future-oriented thinking. We're forecasting how our day is going to be terrible because we couldn't sleep. When in reality, we could have a really good day no matter what. Yes, a lack of sleep is going to make it more difficult, but what if we won the lottery that day? Suddenly, there's no way I'll have a good day because I had the best day of my life. So we want to try to distance ourselves from those really negative appraisals of sleep issues because they can actually promote more sleep issues in the long run. Suddenly, even just getting into our bed kind of makes us tense because it's a reminder to continually think about all those stressful times when we couldn't sleep. So that would be an excellent opportunity to use those mindfulness skills to distance yourself from those appraisals. So that thought, I'll never have a good day on this amount of sleep. We can say, that's just a thought and it's not necessarily the truth. It's not right or wrong. It just is. And suddenly it's a little bit easier to go to sleep. The second component of that model would be behaviors. So there are behaviors that tend to promote a good night's sleep. This is called sleep hygiene. So things like turning off the screen an hour before bedtime, avoiding heavy meals and alcohol right before sleep, getting out of bed if you have any sleep issues, things like that. And it becomes easier to participate in those behaviors if you kind of think of that value of taking care of yourself. So you're able to get that distance from that thought, and suddenly you're able to participate in those behaviors. It also kind of touches on Kelsey's topic nicely about psychological detachment, because I love how her list of detachment activities and recovery activities didn't involve a lot of screens. They involved, getting out into the garden, reading, and things like that. So some of those activities actually are more in line with sleep hygiene in general. And then finally, I wanted to mention, even though our our mindfulness presentation didn't focus on meditation. There's one specific type of meditation that can be very useful in promoting a good night's sleep. It's called progressive muscle relaxation. And basically, it guides the meditator through a series of deep breathing, tightening certain muscles of the body, and then releasing. And so it can be really useful to help you recognize the difference between a tense body and a very relaxed body that is more promotive of good sleep. And there are many guided progressive muscle relaxation exercises on YouTube for free. So if you're having any difficulties falling asleep, I would recommend giving that a try.
Very cool. I know what I'm trying tonight. That sounds fantastic. Great. So I think that is it for our day in the life. Next slide, please. I just want to say thank you to everyone for tuning in. Special thank you to Lindsay for volunteering all of these entertaining photos for us. We're going to do some Q&A. So if you have any questions on things we've covered today, on things that we haven't covered and you wish we did cover, please type them into the chat. We have Kathy, our wonderful coordinator, is going to be feeding us questions. So please feel free to ask away. Thank you so much. Great.
So, Kelsey, I know we had a lot of questions come in ahead of time on the pre-event survey. So while these real-time questions are filtering in, I wanted to take an opportunity to ask you one. So I guess we can kind of think about burnout and exhaustion kind of like something medical that can be diagnosed, and it's often difficult to recognize those signs. So what tips do you have for our viewers about learning to recognize the signs of emotional exhaustion in their own life?
Oh my gosh, fantastic question. And burnout is a World Health Organization recently designated it as a clinical syndrome. So job burnout, it can be a medical diagnosis. You're absolutely right. So job burnout, the way we kind of classically define it, has this emotional exhaustion component, this cynicism, and this decreased personal efficacy component. But how we experience it, right, if you are waking up in the morning and you're still exhausted, if you don't have the energy to go into work, if you are having difficulty sleeping at night, if your work just doesn't light your fire like it used to, these can all be warning signs that you're really starting to cross over into a bad day, a bad week, into something like burnout. And burnout is comorbid with a ton of other really nasty clinical diagnoses like depression or anxiety. So catching burnout early and taking the steps as much as possible to minimize or at least mitigate the risk of becoming burned out at work is really, really important stuff. The social support that we talked about in our presentation is one of them. If any administrators are on the call as well, organizational support is another really big protective factor against burnout. So making sure the organization is supporting teachers and parents during this transition to online, whether it's the emotional support or this informational, practical support to make sure everyone has the resources to do their jobs as effectively as possible. Kristen, another question that came up in some of the pre-event questions, which I just thought was so interesting, was how can we really integrate this trauma-sensitive mindfulness into our online classroom during COVID-19. There's so much going on. There's so much risk and uncertainty in our environments. How can we incorporate some mindfulness practices into online learning?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And I think it was very aware of our viewers who took the pre-event survey to recognize that they might be dealing with anxiety, their students might be dealing with anxiety, but there may also be a sense of grief or a sense of loss. Some of us may be mourning loved ones or things like that, in addition to all of these new stressors. So I do want to point out, like you mentioned earlier, Kelsey, that you and I are workplace psychologists. We're not clinical psychologists. So of course we can't offer recommendations for the clinical management of trauma. However, we do view trauma-sensitive teaching or trauma-informed teaching as a professional skill that can be inserted into your teaching. And so there are a lot of great online resources developed by clinical psychologists and developmental psychologists on trauma-informed teaching. So if you're interested in that, I would recommend doing a little bit more research on that topic. But connected to mindfulness specifically, I would say this is a great opportunity to use that self-compassion component, specifically the common humanity. So recognizing that struggle and particularly trauma might be something that binds us all together. It might be that source of connection between you and your coworker or you and your students in that case. Using mindfulness to scan your environment can also help you identify maybe students who are having more behavioral issues than usual. That could be a sign that maybe they're kind of acting out of some sort of unresolved trauma or particularly heightened emotions. And then kind of checking in with your values. You know, even if you have that very stressful appraisal of, I can't deal with this student's behavioral issues right now, if you're able to kind of think about what your values are in that moment, I think it will ultimately help you make a behavioral choice that's more in line with that trauma-informed teaching paradigm. So going back to some questions for Kelsey. So some of our viewers want to know how to implement healthy habits to manage stress and emotions.
Oh, that is the million-dollar question, isn't it? How to implement healthy habits. So if we could all do the right habits right away, our lives would be much easier, right? I do want to throw back really quickly to some of the stuff Tom talked about caring for our physical health in addition to our psychological and emotional health. And what are some strategies we can use to make sure we're really prioritizing both pieces of that? Because the physiology and the psychology interact together when we talk about stress and emotions, right? When we're stressed, our body tenses up. When we have negative emotions, our body tenses up. And so finding ways to make sure our body is healthy as well as our emotional health is really important. A couple of things that Tom mentioned is eating healthier. Geez Louise, if that was simple, I think we would all be doing it. But small changes build habit. So overhauling my diet it's not going to happen right now. But keeping a protein bar in my car, so I eat that instead of stopping at McDonald's for fries, is a small change I can make now to help build these longer, healthier habits. So for something like eating healthy to help manage your overall psychological health, start with a banana. Start with something really small. Some other things Tom mentioned was exercising, getting out there and really exercising the body, which has the benefit of releasing a lot of the physiological tension we feel when we're really stressed or feeling very negative. If you're that person who can go out and do an hour-long CrossFit workout, rock on with your bad self. I am not. So I'll go for a walk. And then if I wanted to really pair this exercise with some good psychological support, I would call a friend while I'm on my walk. So not only am I exercising and doing something small and simple that I can easily build into my routine, I can even double dip and use it as an opportunity to really get some support as well. And the other thing Tom mentioned was getting enough sleep, which also, geez Louise, if it was as easy as that. One of the things that I personally do is I have an alarm for when I wake up in the morning, but I also have an alarm for when I go to bed at night. I don't know how often I look up and realize, oh my goodness, it is whatever o'clock. I meant to be in bed an hour ago. So setting these reminders to try and lighten the cognitive load for making these various decisions can help us build healthier habits to care for our physical health, which is only going to have good implications for our stress and our emotional health as well.
If I could jump in on that as well. Thanks, Kelsey. I thought that was a really good response. I think it's also important to make the small commitments to those changes. So if you want to adopt a new healthy habit, it can be a very powerful motivator to share that commitment with somebody else. And it can be, as few as one other person or multiple other people that you're making a commitment that you're going to make that change. And then when you follow through on that, it feels good that you followed through on doing what you say you would do. We always feel good if we do what we say we're going to do. And I think that point about including reminders to yourself, putting those healthy habits right into your plan for the day, right along with all the tasks for work and taking care of kids and all those other things that you usually have a calendar reminder for, putting one in there to take care of yourself in whatever form that's going to be, whether it's exercise or taking a mental health break or whatever it is, that can be planned right into your day.
Absolutely. I'm notorious for forgetting to eat lunch. So I have a calendar reminder saying you need to eat something. And one of the best things I can do for my emotional stability in the afternoons is making sure I eat something. We have some really good questions coming through live, so I want to make sure we address them now. So just opening these up to the group. Are there any specific practitioner-friendly research-based resources that you can suggest? So actually, Tom, this one might be for you because I know CDC has some really great resources on psychological health.
Yeah, thanks for that question. So one place to look is around the topic of job stress on the CDC and NIOSH web pages. Everything that is up there is evidence-based or research-based information. So any of those resources that were listed in the latter part of my presentation, those are all, brief evidence-based pieces of information that folks can look at. I think other good resources that we point folks to are the American Psychological Association website. They've got tons of good information there, lots of good research-based information. And I'll stop there and see if there's any others that you all want to mention.
I also want to point out that this is not specific to teachers, but more specific to the discipline of occupational health psychology, which is a field that's focused on safety, health, and well-being of workers. There is a Facebook page for the Society of Occupational Health Psychology, and they frequently have blog posts that translate research into easily digestible and easily implemented kind of nuggets of information. So that's one of the places that I like to go to get like the quick scoop on evidence-based practice.
Perfect. Awesome. Kristen, we have another live chat coming in that I think might be right up your alley. Do you have any recommendations on how to get kids into mindfulness early? Resources for 10 to 12-year-olds?
Yes. So one of the places that I like to start is role modeling. And it's really funny because, I mentioned that I have a young son, and he notices when I have my phone in my hand and when I'm using my phone to escape from my emotions. And he sees it as a direct threat to my attention on him. So he tells me to put it away. But I think just being mindful of how we role model these behaviors that we want our kids to be implementing. And then the second would be kind of making emotional expression a safe place. So often we go into rescuing mode when another person that we care about is talking about stressful experiences or emotions that cause them distress. And in an attempt to make it all better, we kind of put a stop on that emotional expression. We say things like, it's going to all be okay, or no, it's not like that. And really, there can be value in teaching our kids that it's okay to sit with uncomfortable emotions for a little while. Emotions give us a great window into what's important in our life, and they can be a very powerful communicator if something is a little bit off in our values. And so if a kid is sad, or if they're angry, or if they're scared, that emotion doesn't have to go away right away. They can sit with it for a little while. And I think that that's where you as the teacher or the parent can kind of express, I'm here for you while this emotion is here. I'm going to sit with you while this emotion is present.
Yeah, I love that answer. I think there's, a lot of value in, right, the authentic expression of emotions, and hearing that your emotions are, right, they're real, they are valued, and they are your way of perceiving what's going on around you. I'm seeing a couple of other questions in the chat about how to encourage students to speak their feelings, how to help students manage their emotions themselves. So like Kristen said, just to reiterate a little bit, that modeling behavior can be so important. A lot of times we like to pretend that, oh no, I never have any negative emotions. I am just this ray of sunshine all of the time. When it is normal and healthy, particularly with everything that is going on, to feel a little fragile and a little worried and a little scared. And that's a normal and healthy response. And then also, there are adaptive ways to regulate those emotions, to model that adaptive regulatory behavior, and to even help kids learn how to regulate that behavior themselves, right? So going back to our emotion regulation framework, exactly what emotion are you feeling? Can you help someone else, right, a small child or a friend or a colleague or whoever, really identify how they're feeling as well? Like sometimes I'll call my best friend and she's like, oh, I'm so cranky today. And then I talk to her and I realize, no, I'm feeling really guilty for an interaction that I had earlier, right? And that's what's leading to this crankiness. And now that I've identified how I'm feeling, I can take the steps to regulate that emotion, either by engaging in some kind of reparative action for if I'm feeling guilty, if I'm feeling scared, removing the fearful stimulus or reappraising the fearful stimulus so it seems less scary. I can more effectively regulate that emotion. Same thing with others, right? If I know Kristen is feeling really, really overwhelmed, maybe I can help her pinpoint what exactly she's feeling, why she's feeling that way, and then strategies for her to better engage with that emotion and then let that negative emotion go. So I think some of these strategies can apply beyond just ourselves.
I agree. I think there could also be value, and your class best, or you'll kind of get to know your class best. But there also could be value in creating a structured time to kind of let our emotions kind of step to the forefront, and therefore they're not kind of distracting in the background for the whole class period. So there was a particularly stressful time during one of my first years teaching, and it was after a hurricane had canceled our class for 2 weeks in a row. And so we had a bunch of new students who were really nervous about missing that amount of classroom instruction. And a lot of them were new graduate students, so they were without their social support system. They were suddenly away from home, potentially for the first time. And I came in and I wanted to get started right away on my lesson. But I read the room and it was like, this is not the time. Like I could just see how drained everybody was. And so instead of starting with our curriculum as it was prescribed, we just took a little moment to say something we were each excited about in the next couple of days. And for some students, it was as simple as they had bought a cookie that they were really looking forward to eating, but suddenly the whole mood of the class lifted, and therefore those stressful appraisals weren't interfering with learning outcomes for the remainder of the class.
Yeah, absolutely. We are getting some really great questions in the live chat right now. I am so excited. I do see one example around fear that I would like to take a second to address. And I think the discussion, and I'm seeing a couple of other things pop up around fear, anxiety. How can we manage these negative emotions around some kind of threat that we cannot see? And this is one of the ways that I think being really precise with the emotions we're feeling become really important, right? So fear evolutionarily is super adaptive, right? I see a snake in the grass, I am afraid, and so I am motivated to do something to get rid of that threat. There is a direct threat to my health and well-being. I am motivated to do something to get rid of it. But right now, with COVID-19, there's not a direct threat that we can fight or flee or freeze against, right? And so this is where fear can become really maladaptive once we kind of take it out of its evolutionary grounding. And if you layer on anxiety, which is just this general concern, general angst around some kind of threat that we can't really precisely identify, which of course, if we don't know where an infection point is, we might be feeling really, really anxious. Like, I don't know, there's some threat out in the environment. I don't know where it is. I don't know what to do about it. This is where, and I want to be really careful, right? Because I don't want to put a Band-Aid on an issue if we're getting to the level of a generalized anxiety disorder, which you should go to a clinician, right? However, low levels, normal, healthy levels, whatever is normal and healthy in this time that we find ourselves in now, these normal levels of anxiety, that's where disconnecting can be really important. So it may not necessarily be psychologically detaching from our work, but we can also psychologically detach from the news around us, from all these negative news sources coming in. I'm not saying don't read the news, be completely uninformed, but I am suggesting that there may be times where the emotional burden of engaging with these materials may outweigh the benefit that we're getting in that moment. So strategically detaching from some of these things that are causing us fear and anxiety, and then trying to really carefully identify, right, am I feeling fearful? Is there something I can do to erase this threat? Or is there nothing I can really fight against? And so I'm going to use this as an opportunity to engage in some of the mindfulness exercises that Kristen has discussed as a way of distancing myself from these negative emotions that I don't have direct control over. And I think that's one of the things that's so hard about COVID-19 is it's not visible. It's not something we can directly fight against, but it's always just kind of out there. And so this is where the psychological detachment, these mindfulness exercises become increasingly important. And Kristen, I know I'm seeing a couple of questions about specific resources for mindfulness. I don't know if you have any other resources you would love to share with the group.
Yeah, so there's actually a few publicly available resources that I turn to myself when I'm having particularly stressful times. So there are a few free meditations. Just let me check the...
Doing research live, guys. Looking up resources now.
Yeah. So I'm recalling a name such as, I think it's the Center for Mindfulness and Compassion. So it's two experts in mindfulness and self-compassion that have recorded a variety of trainings, webinars, guided meditations, and they very generously made all of their stuff available for free. I also like to use, I think it's called Generation Mindful, which is a great mindfulness resource that's geared towards parents of children, and they kind of break it out by age as well, age group. So it can be a way to teach kids to identify emotions and respond to them in healthy ways. That's kind of fun and not quite so abstract as some of the concepts that we've discussed today.
Great. I'm seeing another question that I really just want to hear the answer to, so I'm going to post it to you as well. How do I manage my stress when all of my coworkers seem to be more knowledgeable than me?
Oh, that is a great question. So I do want to point out that there is something called the imposter syndrome. A lot of my fellow graduate students had it. A lot of my fellow colleagues have it. It tends to be pretty common in people who are high achieving, high performing, and care about their jobs, aka a lot of teachers. And it's kind of this feeling that everyone else is a little bit more knowledgeable and competent than you, and somehow you got here by mistake, and people are going to find you out any minute. And that can cause a lot of extra stress because you're kind of putting all of this all of your resources into preserving what you think is a fake outer shell of competence. But what I would like to challenge you with is that most people have these thoughts that somehow their coworkers are doing better than they are. Somehow their coworkers are more knowledgeable than they are. So I'd really like to encourage you to use that self-compassionate view, especially the common humanity component, and just kind of recognize that even if your coworkers aren't showing it, they're probably struggling with stress and fear and anxiety and struggling to adapt to changes in the same way that you are. And then one of the things that I've kind of learned in a more personal domain of life is to try not to compare my response to the response of somebody else who's in a different life phase with a different set of life circumstances. So maybe a teacher that you're comparing yourself to happens to have a hobby that relies on technology a lot, or maybe they have a spouse that's helping them with the technology setup at their home. Maybe if you feel like you're having more trouble adapting, maybe it's because, you have family responsibilities. Maybe you're getting ready for a lot of other life changes or things like that. So try not to kind of look on the other side of that window and think that you see what other people are going through, because everybody has their own unique struggles and circumstances.
Yeah, that's lovely. I really like your point about being careful about these negative self-evaluations we engage in. And when I talked about psychological detachment, I think you mentioned once I didn't have media on that list because it can be such a mixed bag. Some types of media can be detaching and replenishing and allow us to have it mastery and control and agency. And then other types of media just really allow us to ruminate on how much more polished other people's lives look, how much more resources they seem to have, how much more whatever, and we almost never look upon our own lives kindly. So I think that's a really nice reminder, even with professional efficacy and these feelings of imposter syndrome, just to treat ourselves really kindly and how we evaluate our own abilities. Tom, I'm seeing another question in the chat, which I think might be right up your alley again, asking where can I find resources on COVID-19 and probable infection sources as a way of kind of gathering more and more information to help manage anxiety. Do you have any resources for students, parents, and teachers?
Yeah, sure. So again, I probably sound like a broken record saying go to the CDC website. But there really are just a ton of resources there, whether you want school-specific sorts of information. I see one of the questions that has popped up here has more to do with working in healthcare. There's a whole section that is specifically for healthcare personnel. In fact, there's a mental health and resilience fact sheet specifically for mental health personnel that's different from what we've put together for sort of the more general working population. But I think it brings us back to this sort of delicate balance between addressing our own anxieties with more information, overwhelming ourselves with more information. So, and depending on the particular individual or the circumstance that they're in, that might be one way to ease fear or anxiety, is to equip yourself with the knowledge that you need to understand the thing it is that you're afraid of. At the same time, I know several of us have probably experienced sort of information overload, especially related to the COVID-19 pandemic. So it's really up to you to have a good sense of, okay, now have I given myself enough knowledge and that's enough for now? Now I also need to figure out how to sort of experience and cope with the anxiety that I'm going to continue to experience because the pandemic hasn't gone away and it's not about to go away anytime, especially soon.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I remember when I hit 1 a.m. still scrolling through the New York Times looking at COVID stats, I was like, oh no, it is time to disconnect a little bit.
Yeah.
Kelsey, if it's all right, I'd like to end with one of the questions that came in on the pre-event survey. And it talked about how to create buy-in in your organization for these concepts. And, that's something that we want to acknowledge is these strategies are very powerful in an individual's work life. They're also even more powerful if you have an environment where the healthy choice becomes the easy choice. So self-care kind of becomes the norm, and you don't feel like you stick out so much for self-care or talking about emotions or things like that. And so we wanted to kind of give some resources on how to promote that supportive environment, whether you're an employee or whether you're an administrator. So first, I would recommend checking out the resources that Dr. Cunningham pointed out for administrators. So if you're an admin on the call, definitely make sure that you're paying attention to those resources. You can also pay attention to a topic what's called transfer of training. So it's the idea that you learn concepts here in this training program, but then you might be going to a completely different environment where you're trying to apply them. So really try to think about the similarities between what was discussed on this call, maybe the day in the life, try to see any points of similarity between your workday, and then really think about how that application could work in your specific life. If you are an admin, then try to make the environment as supportive as possible for that transfer. So ask learners about, how are you feeling today? And if you knew that they were interested in taking this course, maybe ask them what they learned in this course and how you can make their life easier to implement that. And then finally, I wanted to cover a concept called champions. So there are some kind of wellness-focused movements that happen in the workplace that really begin kind of as a grassroots movement. And it's not because a leader in an organization identified it as a strategic initiative. It's because those on the forefront identified it as a need. And so many workplaces have kind of routes for getting your voice heard in an anonymous or confidential way. So if you have maybe an employee opinion survey or an opportunity to voice your opinion in a safe way, make it known what resources you need. Because often we find that administrators and leaders, they care, they just need to know what the needs are. So with that, we are right on the top of the hour. I wanted to thank all of our learners for tuning in today. We really enjoyed having you here, and we enjoyed your thoughtful questions. We're wishing you a very healthy and safe school year, and we want to thank you for all that you're doing for our learners. We will be sending out a post-event survey, so we want to encourage you to take that. It will help us evaluate the effectiveness of this session and determine needs for future outreach sessions. So on behalf of our speakers and the Sunshine Education and Research Center, I wanted to say thank you so much for your attendance today.